Okay, okay. We are now live. Okay. Uh, okay. We are now live. Okay. Thank you for joining us today, Abhay.
Thanks for having me, Disha.
Okay. So today we have Mr. Abhay Rangan. He is the co-founder of Goodmylk, which is a plant-based dairy company. He's also been an animal rights activist in the past and the co-founder of and the founder of SAF. He is he's been under the Forbes 30 under 30 list, both Asia and India, in 2019 and 2020. We're happy to have you today to talk about the animal rights movement in India and how animal agriculture plays a role in environmental degradation. Thank you for joining us.
I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. Can't wait to get started.
So you can start if you have any introduction, and then we'll proceed with the questions that we already have.
Sure. I think it's really important for people who have various interests in making the world a better place to recognize our commonalities and band together and see how we can create systemic change. My own activism was fairly individualistic back then, but I think as an evolution for me, it has been working with larger sets of systems. Earlier it was person to person, and then it was person to organization, then person to corporate, and then person to hopefully at some point. I hope that my own impact extends in a way that it's person to government. So hopefully, and I know this process isn't a one-person thing, and you need numbers, you need the strength of people who are like-minded. And for one, I was really excited about this webinar too because a really powerful environmental movement is now looking at animal rights seriously, and that is something I've been waiting for a really long time. And I'm really glad that this confluence has happened.
Could you tell us more about how the animal rights movement in India started off and how it has been since then and now?
Uh, there's very little data about how it actually started, but what I do know is, in the late 90s, a group of passionate animal rights activists got together, started doing campaigns, and it sort of has been in waves. And it sort of subsided for a while. There were people doing regular activism events, but none of them scaled up as an organization to do it. Of course, there's organizations like PETA that has been around for a really long time, and there were a lot of animal welfare organizations that were then there, but they didn't look at animal rights as a movement that they wanted to be a part of. Contrasted to today, where most animal welfare organizations are looking at animal rights as a serious part of their movement, and with, of course, a lot of grassroots activists now coming up and organizing. They're not necessarily scaling up under a single brand name, but they are collaborating across different hubs all over the country and just creating this movement that is becoming a powerful voice for the animals. And it's nice to see that what couldn't scale back then because we didn't have as much access to technology. Instant messaging wasn't there, and of course this was all around the time I was born. So there, it speaks to a different time. But now, I think because everybody has the awareness, has the tools to reach out to other people, and because of social media existing, we now have the capability of reaching every single person directly all over the world. And I think that's helped people not only increase awareness, which is sort of an obvious takeaway, but also help people collaborate better, help strangers collaborate better, and create this joint movement that everybody can be a part of.
What made you join the animal rights movement and what motivated to go vegan in the first place? And how was the transition from you to becoming a vegan to becoming an activist?
My parents turned vegan before I did. We've always cared about animals as a family. We used to feed the dogs that lived on our streets, but we never really made the connection that dogs have moral value that is similar to ours, and so do cows and hens and pigs and goats and turkeys and buffaloes. And making that realization was key for my parents to then turn vegan. And of course, me being a rebellious teenager didn't exactly listen to reason at that point. But 6 months down the line, I did my own research and really found out what they were saying and made my own conclusions about why I wanted to be vegan. And then, on New Year's Eve, my sister and I turned vegan. Uh, I think fundamentally, when you turn vegan, it's sort of uh, getting into some mode of shock because you realize that there's animal agriculture and animal abuse everywhere around you. It's not always obvious when you don't know what you're looking for, but when you do, when you know what you're looking for, it's everywhere, and it's pretty shocking because you don't expect it to be as rampant or as large scale as it is. So naturally, as someone ambitious, I wanted to set up a response that scaled. And that was my reason for getting into activism, which is really to understand how I can create more impact. But really, over time, it turned into how can I scale impact using leverage like technology, capital, human resource, and all of that. So for me, I think it's been at a individual scale, and then probably at a really small scale, and then hopefully at some point it's going to be large scale. So that's been my transition. That's been my journey.
Yeah, I think that's amazing to hear about how you started out. So, can you tell us more about how the initial stages of SAR was, and what was like the first thing, like some of the first few campaigns that you ran?
I actually got the idea for SAV when I was volunteering for a friend of mine who also ran campaigns in Bangalore. I think SAR was one of the first branded grassroots efforts to come into the country. Although we did scale it up to some extent. We expanded to 10 cities and so on. My personal realization there was that at some point it started becoming more about scaling and having more of these cities under our brand name and having more of these countries under our brand name as opposed to really thinking about individual the individual impact of each chapter that we set out to establish. So for me, it was a difficult journey in understanding that vanity metrics like how many cities you're present in, how many countries you're present in, what is your social media following. All of these, they play a role, but what the bottom line really is that we must measure our own individual efforts. And there's some great organizations doing work on understanding the statistical impact of each and every type of activism. Animal charity evaluators is a great example of that. Analytics is a good example of people that are trying to bring data to the animal rights movement. That wasn't a very big part of what we did, although I'm very glad that is changing now. And the newer grassroots organizations that exist in India today, they're very data driven. They follow up. They use tech very seriously. They almost in many ways behave like a very professional organization, almost like you're speaking to a corporate, but it's really fueled by individual passions. For me, I think one more realization was that it started becoming. I also was. We started scaling the movement at a point where hero worship was common in the community, right? So a lot of people would look at someone and say, "This person's right no matter what," and I'm going to like or respond to comment in support of this person no matter where it's going. And I had a bit of that going for me, although eventually I started veering towards craving more of these things as opposed to really hunkering down, looking down on the ground and focusing on impact. So those are my lessons from that time. And I'm glad that the movement today does not have people that they subscribe to as an absolute authority on what the animal rights movement should do and what it shouldn't. There's diversity in thought, and people like ideas, but they don't follow people necessarily, and therefore you have a lot of ground for everybody to share and contribute, because flat structures are great in terms of increasing innovation and increasing diversity in the organization as well. So that I think has been one great thing that's happened lately.
Do you have any movements that are working right now in India or say Bangalore, which is where you're from, that you recommend to people so that are doing some great work on ground as well as online?
I think Bangalore Brigade for Animal Liberation, I'm an absolute admirer. I wish I had done what they are doing, because they don't have hero worship as part of their movement. They're all a bunch of equal people working to make them, take the movement forward. And there's this attitude about them that is about serving the community, that is about being servants to the cause, not necessarily what I've seen from my time at least, and what I did as well was, which is to assume the role of leadership, and not assume the role of being a servant of the community. And there's a very tangible difference in your own approach when you think you're a servant versus when you think you're destined to lead, or you assume the role of leadership, sort of self-proclaimed in that sense. So honestly, big fan of what they're doing right now. And yeah, I think I would recommend their model. I know it's been inspired from a lot of places, so it's not unique to Bangalore. It's common. It's happening more and more across the world, and it's truly bringing the power of the movement to the individual people, and not necessarily concentrating it in certain pockets, where not where the best decision isn't always made.
So going forward, since currently climate change is such a huge aspect, do you think animal rights activists are also talking about how animal agriculture influences climate change, or are they sticking to ethics of animal agriculture and pushing that to for people to go vegan?
Uh, there's different schools of thought on this, right? So a lot of people say that in order to be vegan, your primary driver must be animal rights. And some people say if you're not that, you can call yourself plant-based. I personally don't subscribe to that level of gatekeeping. I think we need all the allies we can get. To keep your definitions. Do what you want with it. That's not necessarily what I would engage in. But I think part of becoming more conscious about the world around us, you can't help but make the connection anyway. So as a vegan, if I'm being vegan for the animals, I must necessarily ask myself, is cutting trees therefore kind to animals or not? Because animals have nests in trees, right? So when we are in many ways harming the environment is in many ways harming the animals. So I don't think you can look at them in a vacuum, and whatever your personal motivations may be. And I also think smart people who are making conscious choices will tend to veer to the same direction, which is, let's say you start from the climate change side and really start thinking about how climate emissions are making the world, emissions are making the world a bad place, and then you're necessarily going to think about ways in which you can reduce the footprint, and animal agriculture and your contribution to it becomes a factor there, and a big one. So I see these common points across the groups of people that I've spoken to and interacted with. So I don't have any prescriptions on what it should be, but mostly observations on what it is and how best we can leverage that.
That was very insightful. So a few of our audience have a few questions. I think the first one is a lot of people a lot of environmentalists first started out with the climate movement was started by indigenous people, and indigenous people often don't have access to say uh, plants all the time, so they do hunt for a living, be it in the forest or fishing. So how will indigenous people go vegan or plant-based?
Could you repeat those last 5 seconds? I lost you.
I was just asking about how indigenous people who are mainly dependent on hunting for their consumption, how will they go vegan, or if it is feasible for them to restrict themselves to a plant-based diet?
Uh, for me, I think effective activism comes from looking at what is the lowest hanging fruit that you can get today, right? And for me, it is the urban population that has access to everything. Uh, Long-term systemic change will happen when we get that first critical mass, and you achieve that critical mass by looking at what is the lowest hanging fruit. For me, that's corporations that can increase more plant-based options in their menu. There's people who live in who live in privilege, who have access to plant-based food, who have access to information, access to internet, or at least easier access to internet than some other people might have. So chances are, if you're listening to this webinar, you already have the tools it takes to be vegan. And in India, especially where a lot of native food and the local cuisine is already vegan, it may not be as hard for you to switch. But uh, I come from the understanding that anybody can be vegan, but it is not up to my place to go towards the people that are most vulnerable and then ask them, to be vegan while I'm conveniently ignoring the people that can be. So more of a data-driven approach for me is let's tackle the biggest population that we can get that's easily accessible and that has easy access, and then let's work our way from there. Eventually, I think when we ease systemic barriers to access plant-based food, namely supply, availability, price, all of that, and we get to a point where everybody can access plant-based food as easily as they can access animal products, then we can make these asks. I'm not saying you can't make these asks right now, but I think the smarter thing is to make asks to the people who can make that change.
We do have a few more questions. So one person has asked thoughts on extremely violent images that frequently accompany animal rights messaging. Do you think that it's too much, or could it, and if it could turn people away from the movement?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have an answer to it. I personally don't prefer it, although I know watching documentaries like horrors in India's dairy industry and sitting through 6 minutes of Earthlings was enough for me to make that transition. So I don't know if I would blast it on a screen somewhere, but I mean, it is the truth, right? It is not animated stuff. It is what happens to animals in slaughterhouses and dairy farms and all of that every day. So yeah, I would defer it to what is best in that context. Really, if you're dealing with a bunch of people who you think might be resilient to that message, maybe it's a better option. Or if you're going to the general public, maybe ask their permission before you show it to them. I remember a time where we did a campaign with VR headsets. We got a really nice donor who donated these headsets to us, and we asked people, hey, this is going to put you inside a slaughterhouse. It's not going to be pleasant, but I think it's important that you know what you're doing, and we handed it over to them, and they made that choice to be involved. Uh, I think part of your question also asks, what about areas where you can't ask for permission? I don't know the answer to that. Some people do it, some people don't. I personally, now that I've been vegan for such a long time, I tend to unfollow people on Facebook who post images or videos like these because I've already seen all of it, and it doesn't help my mind space to think about all of that, because it is a constant thing that you are already, it's something that you carry with you anyway. So don't have a clear answer on that. It depends on the context, really.
Thank you for that. Another question is, should animal liberation activists start focusing more on measures and aspect of dealing with systemic change rather than individual change, so that they can focus on consumerism eliminating consumerism for animal liberation?
I think veering towards either extremes is bad. If you're doing only systemic outreach, then you're ignoring the power of the individual to make these choices. If you're focusing only on individual choices, the time you can, it's going to take a very long time for you to get to any systemic change. So I think if it informs your own personal activism, take a look at what you're good at. I realized that I was really good at presenting to audiences or speaking to people in corporate settings, and that's sort of more what I wanted to do as well. So I veered to that. But I know people that are, incredible at one-on-one conversations, that are, deeply evocative, passionate speakers, that would make way higher an impact on someone than I would, for example. So leverage your strengths as a community. So I think both approaches are important. And if you want to look at what you can do, just look at your strengths and see where best you can be effective.
So, Abhay, you started out as an activist, but now you're running Goodmylk, and you've seen both aspects of it, individual and systemic. So, what would you say is the difference is in your experience, and which one do you think personally has made more impact?
Um, I've I've come to personally prefer systemic impact because, for one, and this is not a comment on the broader animal rights movement. This is a comment on my personal journey, so please take it with that in mind. I've come to prefer systemic outreach because it personally is better for my mental well-being. When I was an activist and I was young, I was 16, I was really angry, and at this point, I was at this point where I was in constant conflict with people who didn't agree with me. And I think what it led to at that point was a lot of burning of bridges from people I can never now reach in a way that I could have. And fundamentally lost some opportunities on really good friendships and relationships. So uh, it comes from a different time, of course, but now what I see is activists are really, especially from what I've seen of b-ball campaigns that I've had the chance to witness, is that people are very calm. Nobody gets angry, nobody shouts, even online. Aside from a pocket of people, everybody is, willing to engage in dialogue and have conversation. So times have changed since then for me, and even what I'm witnessing now. But personally, I've come to think about, I have 24 hours a day, and these are my strengths. So what can I leverage more? And I like talking to systemic stakeholders. It is a great opportunity to suddenly change the pie by a larger fraction, and that's exciting to me. Yeah.
Could you tell us more about what Goodmylk is currently working on and how you've grown from when you initially started? I think you started it when you were 18, and
Right.
it's been a while since then. So how has it progressed, and what what you are currently working on?
Sure. So when we started out, it was with the intention of making plant-based food affordable and accessible. So that sort of remained a mantra throughout, although we've added some things to it since then. So when we started out, it was my mom making it in the kitchen. We didn't necessarily care. We didn't necessarily care where what the ingredients were, as long as we could get cheap sources of plant-based protein. So naturally, what we were looking at was soy, peanuts, and all of that. And then we were following the trend a little back then. We were looking at almond milk, coconut milk, all of these popular milks that have already been around for a while. And there are other people who did it better than we ever could. So that was our intent. Of course, we didn't know the things we did back then. So we were doing, we were making these products in the kitchen, and I was delivering them on my bike. And then we slowly expand to having a delivery team and all of that. But fundamentally, what changed our course the largest was understanding that it's not enough to just have plant-based products be affordable, aka cheap. That was the mindset that we went into it with. It's also important to think about how people use the product. So if you call your product a milk but it doesn't behave like a milk in any way, then you're not necessarily creating much impact, because people are going to use it as a juice or as a healthy beverage as opposed to a milk. So we started thinking more about functionality, how to make our products taste like dairy products, how to make them behave like dairy products, and that informed all the steps that we've taken ever since. And I think today, where we supply these products to families across the country, and all of these products have a high rating in terms of how functional they are. We have a few institutional customers who buy it and use it in lieu of dairy. I think that has been our biggest change, and what I think is going to drive our growth as well.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. Vivek asked about how during the lockdown, a lot of animal agriculture setups like slaughterhouses have been closed, and this has both benefited the environment as well as animals. How do you think, and the pollution rates have gone down, so how do you think this can be continued or handled once the lockdown is lifted?
I think fundamentally, I would defer back to incentives. What are the incentives for animal agriculture hotspots to remain open? It is looking at, fundamentally, it is that there's money in it. I would change that perception. I would point out to how a lot of corporations outside of India are really looking at adding plant-based options to their menu. They are making a commitment to move away from eggs or move away from dairy. Some of them have even completely changed to being entirely vegan. So it is looking at what incentives these people respond to, and then making sure that these incentives are available to them. part of that is outreach, right? Because you can't tell anybody, any meat company in India that plant-based is an interesting space for them to enter and and ask them to exit the animal agriculture space if there aren't any consumers here. So now that that's why I think systemic change and personal change go hand in hand, because you need to be able to influence the system from both the supply side and the demand side. Hoping that the supply will stop because it has stopped temporarily is more of a it's not going to continue that way. People are going to come back. People are going to want to consume animal products, and because Indians are now having access to higher incomes. Fundamentally, there is a lot of growth in the consumption of meat and even dairy products in the country. So we have a long way ahead in terms of dismantling these systems and challenging them, and from both the supply and the demand side. So I would defer back to thinking about how we can be more effective right now, because they aren't going to stop post this lockdown. They're going to come right back, maybe with lesser demand, but give it a few years, it's going to come right back. If we don't, pedal to the metal with respect to awareness and supply.
Thank you for that. The next question is, a lot of people, even though even though a lot of slaughterhouses are under lockdown, people grow animals for their personal consumption, or there are people who depend on it for their existence. So what is your opinion on sustainable animal agriculture or small scale animal agriculture where it's locally grown and it's used for either personal consumption or consumption of just the local people?
I think sustainable animal agriculture is a misnomer, right? So if you really look at it, the unit footprint of having animals graze in large pasture lands, let them consume a lot of the wild vegetation, and really, if factory farming was scaled to a point where all the animals had their space, it simply wouldn't be able to scale to the level that it has right now. Small scale animal agriculture can be looked at a very zoomed in lens, where you look at this one particular unit and say, okay, this works for now in terms of how sustainable it looks, although the cruelty to animals still never goes away. But when you scale it to 100,000 farms, then suddenly you have a bigger problem. So I don't see any form of animal agriculture, whether it is small scale or large scale or widespread or cage free or anything like that. I don't see it at any point feeding the population effectively in a way that isn't broken. Factory farming is broken in many ways. So is small scale rearing of animals. You simply can't scale it up and feed the same number of people that you had planned to with factory farming. So, and of course, not to mention the horrendous impacts that these have on the animals themselves. One could argue that animals have more space here, etc. But the fundamental thing is animals are still killed, exploited, and there is no right way to do the wrong thing there. Although I think as activists we must expect that the system will move in a way that there is going to be smaller reform here as opposed to stopping it overnight. But I think personally I would demand for the whole thing, for it to be done, abolished, and then see what progress we can make there.
We have another question from one of our viewers. What reasons will you attribute for unwillingness of hardcore animal rights activists to acknowledge the health and the environmental benefits of not consuming animal products? Because a lot of animal rights activists only push the ethics of it, but they don't consider people who go vegan for health or environmental reasons.
I think part of the incentive is that the health argument has chinks in it. It is sometimes not a very strong argument, because there are healthy vegans and there are unhealthy vegans. There are healthy meat eaters and there are unhealthy meat eaters. So part of the incentive might be that if you turn vegan for health, then and you don't start making the connections, then when you're back to being healthy, you might relapse back to your old habits without really considering the others. But I think that's what I think is the reason why they would say that. Although I haven't personally of late bothered myself with differentiating these people. I think people let them make, they're going to make their choices no matter what you tell them. It's up to you to give information the way you want to. So I prefer talking about the ethical side of it. That's my personal preference. I know there's some people who speak about the environmental side of it, and different things resonate with different people, right? So I think it's wrong to fundamentally say don't use this approach or don't use that approach. I think what might be better is to say I use this approach, and if you like it, please, obviously use the same approach. Nobody has a copyright. But to say this approach is going to hurt the movement, I think is being deterministic to a point of foolishness, because there is really no data we have. If anybody says deterministically that this is going to affect the movement in this way, then they're wrong. They're being intellectually dishonest. You eventually always want to refer back to the numbers and see what's making the largest amount of change. So I personally, while that is my approach, I would not go to someone who is doing work for our movement and say, you suck because you follow a different approach. I think I would look at what are they doing better than I am that I can learn from and implement in my approach. Let time be the test of your method, right? So it's easy to signal online and say, oh, I'm a better person than you because my approach to activism is better. But let time show the answer. Let's see whose approach is better, and let's have the numbers dictate the outcomes.
Because the climate change conversation is more active currently, do you think more people are going vegan now for environmental reasons?
I would say a lot of people are dropping the consumption of animal products, right? So I don't have the numbers on whether more people are going vegan fully, but I do know that there is a strong bias in everybody to reduce their consumption of animal products, and that's a start, right? That's where I would keep it at. I just simply don't know what's contributing to what. At Goodmylk, we've done some surveys, and there was an interesting bunch of questions around. A lot of people did point out eventually subscribing to it from an ethics perspective. I think the second highest cohort was those people who were subscribing to Goodmylk because they wanted to minimize their footprint. So it's an interesting question, one to think about, not one I have an immediate answer for.
Another question is that how will people who live in food deserts go vegan, or where agriculture is more unsustainable than animal agriculture because it's harder to grow plants there and it's more resource intensive compared to raising animals?
I would bring it back to thinking about what you can do to prevent the problem of food deserts in the first place, right? This is not a problem that veganism can solve. Veganism solves the problem of animal cruelty, and that's the focus, right? So how you want to scale it up is very contextual, very dependent on the area you live in, etc. So the one size fits all approach, the veganism being the panacea for solving all of the world's problems, is a fallacy again. I would think about, so food deserts exist now. How would I solve the problem of food deserts before then asking people to go vegan? Because it's also unfair to expect that everybody in the vegan movement should suddenly then focus on only solving problems in food deserts. Everybody has a specialization. Some people are better at advocating for the climate. Some people are better at advocating for feminism. Some people are better at advocating for animal rights. Let people do their thing. Don't expect everybody to solve everybody's problem, because then you blunt the weapon that you have, which is the sharpness that you've built in understanding how the nuances of your movement, the nitty-gritties that exist. So this whole expansion to generalization is something I would strongly push against, because let people do their thing. When you have a highly committed people who are highly specialized, then you're more likely to achieve these individual pushes in the boundary that's going to overall expand the boundary, as opposed to all of them coming together focusing on one point that doesn't push the boundary as much. I recognize that it's very abstract visual, but hopefully what I'm trying to impart is specialization is important. Let people specialize, and if there's someone who can specialize on solving the problem of veganism and food deserts, boom, I'd love to find them and have a chat with them.
That's amazing. The next question is, what, since a lot of people in India are going vegan, what about affordability specifically of vegan dairy substitutes, and what is Good Milk's approach to this?
Our approach to this is to build the economies of scale. What I think some things that it's not always the owners of these companies who drive up prices, right? I know there a lot of and there's good criticism out there that a lot of vegan businesses hype up prices, and this criticism wouldn't exist if people if people didn't actually do it. So there is that criticism must be taken, and we must take that feedback in. But also fundamentally look at the system, because dairy is given so much subsidy and dairy is taxed at 0%. For example, plant-based dairy is taxed at anywhere between 12 to 18%. So because of this taxation alone, even if these products were at the exact same cost price, the selling price would have to vary because there's an additional tax on the non-dairy option. So, but it's also unfair to defer only to the systemic problems and say, oh, it's taxed higher and it's not economies of scale, so we're not going to do our part until everybody has solved this problem around us. That's why startups have this responsibility to push the boundary, and that's what startups typically do. They scale fast, they scale quickly, and they solve a very key problem. What we're trying to solve is we're trying to be as affordable as we can be. Good milk today is cheaper than organic milk. So that's a start. For people who are looking to be more sustainable, if your choices are not dairy but organic dairy and good milk, hey, we're already at that price point. So if you have the option of making that switch, do it now. But if you're someone who cannot access that, then we're going to get to you in a little bit. Just let us build those economies of scale. Things take time to solve, and as much as I'd love to see someone, there's been pockets of people who can make it for really cheap. If you make it at home, if you take a really cheap plastic pouch, or if your customer gives you a dabba, you can fill it in, give it back to them. But you're not solving the fundamental problems around distribution, manufacturing in bulk, scaling your enterprise up. All of these things are important, because if you have 24 hours in a day, would you rather impact 10 people or a million people, right? So I think most people would tend to solve the problem of a million people because we care fundamentally, and caring means that we are open to avenues where we can care more as well, as opposed to caring less. So it's important to think about scale and all of that. So hopefully the few startups that exist in this space are looking at all of these factors and making the best decision possible. There are ways that everybody can do better, including Good Milk. We have some really cool members of our team who are very into the sustainability movement, that are looking at pushing the boundaries on what we are doing. They call us out. They tell us that, oh my God, some of the packaging you're using can be better. And we're open to listening to that feedback and seeing ways we can do better.
That's really great to hear. So I'm glad to hear that Goodmylk is trying to go more sustainable in their operations. Another question we have is that a lot of people don't consider animal agriculture a problem in India. How would you address someone who thinks this is purely a Western issue?
I mean, India has slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses involve killing people. I don't see how that's a Western concept. I understand that a lot of the videos online come from countries where there are a lot of undercover activists. That's I think one problem that has been being solved lately by undercover activists in India actually is that we didn't have enough undercover videos, undercover footage of slaughterhouses in India. Also, I think one must consider that filming in dangerous locations like slaughterhouses where implementability of law is in question and where your physical well-being is at harm. It is also a lot to ask of our activists to go into slaughterhouses or plants where they can be put at physical harm. In countries where laws around this are laws protect undercover investigators and all of that, and hurting them leads to very stringent and strong punishments. That hasn't yet translated to India. So first, there's a supply problem in the sense that people are scared to go out and do it, and for very good reasons. But off late there have been more people. The power of social media, you can go on Facebook Live anytime, and it's helped people bring a lot of this into the focus. India is about 300 million plus cows, and there is a large number of animals for a country like India. And anybody who thinks that it isn't happening need only go out, look for the signs, go to your nearest dairy plant, look at the filth that animals live in. Ask people what happens to male calves, and really do the math yourselves. How is milk available for such a low price? the answer is it's not that it's a fundamentally cheap product. It is that the environment and the animals are bearing the true cost of it. So uh, uh, you know, but of course it requires willingness of the person to really go and look. And you can only bring the horse to the water, but you can't make the horse drink the water. So um, uh, it's yeah, it's a it's an incentives problem from there as well.
A follow-up to one of your previous answers was, how has the government addressed why they distinguish so much between plant-based dairy and animal-based dairy? Because systemic change, like you mentioned, is very important. And what is the government doing to address it?
I think fundamentally, and this is of course not speaking about our current government or previous governments, but generally the role of government is to, ensure equitable opportunities for all. And I think looking at how large the dairy industry could have been in India, and the success story of Amul in terms of the economic impact it has on our country, fundamentally they are trying to do right by most farmers, but they aren't keep taking into account the environment or the animals or the ecosystem that we live in. It is up to us as a voting population to tell the government that these things matter as well. Earlier, because people didn't have access to the same level of information that they do today, nor were they as incentivized to speak up, nor did they have the tools to speak up. These voices they've always existed, I think, but they didn't reach they weren't amplified because they had no leverage at that point. So uh, and the government did what it was supposed to do in the sense that they encourage the economic growth and earning opportunities for farmers all over the country. But obviously, with every decision that is taken, there's good and there's bad, and there has been an immense bad in terms of what it has done to our environment and animals. So uh, uh, yeah, that I think speaks to why they're still not taxing dairy and still taxing plant-based dairy, because they don't see it as a, if plant-based dairy employs 20 lakh people across the country, you can go and ask for subsidies, because the employment of 20,000 people depend on plant-based dairy. So at this point, it isn't the case. Plant-based dairy or plant-based products in general are a really small employer. I doubt that there are even 10,000 people in the country that are employed by plant-based companies. So let's increase that number, and then make the same asks. And I think that's what's going to change taxation and subsidies and all of that.
Another question to the same follow-up question is, how often do you have to deal with unproductive or idealistic opposition to Goodmylk, and how do you deal with that on a personal level?
For one, I think it's important to understand that I myself am an idealist in many ways, and in many ways an unproductive idealist. And it's important for dreamers to exist. And I'm not calling myself one. Just some of the people I happen to work with are incredibly smart people who have the audacity to dream of things that don't exist. And it would serve me well to listen to them, and it would serve all of us well to listen to them, and just maybe not dismiss them immediately, because you're thinking like, okay, this is not economically feasible, this is not commercially possible, people are never going to adopt into this, people are never going to be able to do that or that. I think first it's important to have an open mind about what even the possibilities might be, even though very valid criticisms are welcome. People can dream, but the objective on the ground realities must be considered in this, but in no way must either of these be dismissed. So while I myself have gotten shot at people who have come to me with very idealistic, views that aren't very practical, and a lot of them tend to be vegan because they are vegan and a lot of them have been long-term vegans because they turned vegan at a time where society didn't look at it as something that was cool. They were vegans before veganism was cool, and they face a lot of ridicule from their families, from their friends, and it takes a certain level of being stubborn to stick to your values. And it is these people that have that are the giants that our movement stands on today. And we must recognize that dreamishness and that stubbornness that have gotten us to this point. So yeah, I mean, it sounds nice to say, but harder to do, of course. But something for all of us to take away, I guess.
Another question is, follow up on the same question. It sounds like a good FF campaign to have cut taxes on the plant-based dairy. Additionally, how do people make, as a society, as a collective responsibility, how do we make plant-based food more affordable and accessible to the masses? lower sections of the society, because even though a lot of products are relatively affordable, there is a nutrient level that they should be consuming. So
Sure.
that comes with education. So how do you I think how do you put that out to the lower section of the society?
Sure. There's multiple ways to approach this, right? One is you could start a plant-based startup that focuses specifically on solving for really cheap plant-based protein, which I think nobody has done very well, because also startups in general they always lose money until they start making money. So people are always concerned about unit economics, etc. Another great way to do this is start a non-profit, right? Start a meals program, have people donate to it, and then you can distribute it to people. Uh, 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 you know, and a lot of the government midday meal scheme itself is in many ways vegetarian, and more often than not vegan too, because sambar rice and sabzi and chapati, all of that's vegan by default. So India is a very unique country in the sense that a lot of the local cuisine is vegan anyway. So just make plant-based food does not mean almond milk or walnut rice milk or even cashew oat milk for that matter. It just means not consuming animals and consuming plants instead. Although, for example, okay, I just say not consuming animals because mushrooms are easily consumed by plant-based people and they're not plants. But uh, you it's easy to be eating plant-based food in India. But if you bring in these external things that signal status, like, oh, I must consume almond milk in order to be a vegan, or I must consume soy in order to be vegan, whatever that is for you, maybe drop that preconceived notion and look at rice is vegan, wheat is vegan, sambar rice is vegan, chapati, dal, roti, whatever. All of these things that are very nutritious fundamentally are vegan. So look at making them accessible. With specific answer to how do you make plant-based dairy affordable to everybody, it is. I don't see an immediate answer for it outside of people making it at home, and you can empower these people to learn how to make it at home, and everybody can, because it's really cheap to make plant-based milk at home. But there are obvious quality differences. You don't get the same performance and texture and taste. But I don't see it as impossible. I just see different variables and different factors. Right. In fact, a really big example of, I know they might not want to necessarily identify as plant-based, but for example, Akshay Patra is a great example of an organization that delivers quality, nutritious vegetarian meals to people, and it is not a stretch for organizations like that to go vegan. So that's a really good example, I think, of people already doing this work, although they may not go with the same brand name.
A few of our audience have one question in common, that is, what if there is a ban on slaughters? What will happen to all the cows and animals that were raised for slaughter? They will destroy crops and cause accidents on the road.
It's an interesting question. What I would and of course, a lot of these things are loaded questions, right? You must consider the full context behind. Now, sure, it's going to, in the short term, cause a lot of environmental damage, but the long-term environmental damage caused by continuing this cycle of cruelty is a lot more. So it is the option is not animal agriculture suddenly stops one day, because it's not even realistic, right? So I tend to not deal in hypotheticals, because you get questions like, what happens if you're stuck with a pig on a desert island? Are you going to eat the pig? I mean, what are the odds that I would even be stuck in a desert island in the first place, right? So similarly, the question really is, what are the odds that slaughter is banned overnight, right? I mean, it's not a realistic scenario. The realistic scenario is that it's going to gradually end. Hopefully, that curve is sooner than you think it is, but it's not going to be 300 million cows in India suddenly one day no zero demand. That's an unrealistic scenario. So answering that question in any way would be it's not. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be able to provide a good answer, but neither is the question very realistic.
A follow-up to the same question. What about the people who are engaged in clouds? I think this also answers the same thing. But what about the people who are engaged in cow slaughter? What about their jobs and their livelihoods?
Right. So, with any decline of industries comes the emerging of new industries, right? So, a lot of jobs were lost lost due to automation, but new jobs were created in the software space. And it's a commonly used example for any person who says that jobs are dying in this industry, but new jobs are always being created. So if the change is gradual, it's not going to be sudden. People are not. It's going to be maximum dairy consumption and suddenly zero dairy consumption. It's going to be gradual. Then there come opportunities to retrain people. And it's not that what we've learned is also a lot of the dairy making process is not all that different from plant-based dairy. Some of the upstream processes are different, but plant-based dairy still needs pasteurization, all of that. So aside from the local milking the cows, which is something that you can retrain people to do different things. I don't have the answer to that because I'm no oracle. I can't see the future, but it just seems to me that if the demand for plant-based dairy increases, and I'm an optimist for the future in the sense that I see that a lot of vertical farms are going to come in. You can grow a lot more crops without soil in the same places where you are able to cut down forests and then grow crops instead. So I just see all this boom of opportunities coming together, and there's going to be jobs there, right? Sure, some people I think are going to be impacted adversely, but then you must again question what is the greater good that we can accomplish here. And no change is easy. All change involves some level of pain. So look at minimizing that and look at retraining people. But it is not an excuse to not move in that direction.
Another question by Radhika that can you comment on the problems surrounding intensive vegan alternatives like almond milk and quinoa and food products like that?
I think they've been informed by two things. One is that because a lot of people who have privilege can access veganism, they also want to consume products that signal status and that signal that they're able to consume premium products that it's not necessarily a vegan problem. I think it's more of a there's this intersection of people who are privileged and an intersection of people who consume vegan products, and that common that space in the Venn diagram that is common. Some of those people want to signal status and they want to go after some of those things that look good on Instagram or whatever it may be that signals status really. So I don't know how it solve that problem because there are always going to be people that want to signal status. There are always going to be people that want to consume the most expensive option, and there are going to be companies that provide the most expensive option. But my hope for the future is that organizations that are replacing, and it's a good expectation too, because you can't expect everybody to pay $300 for almond milk. New organizations are going to come up that focus on being sustainable, and the modern consumer is so conscious that they're going to call you out anyway. All of these companies are forced to now introduce oat milk. All of these big plant-based dairy companies in the US, they were only selling almond milk or only selling cashew milk, and suddenly now there's an explosion in oat milk. So now everybody wants to go after the next big thing. Thankfully, the wave, as I see it, is being informed by young, smart people who want the best thing for the environment and for the planet and for the animals who live in it. So it's eventually over a period of time, the world is going to move to a place where the ideal thing is completely sustainable plant-based dairy alternative that tastes exactly like milk, smells like milk, and is probably cheaper than milk, and is negligible in terms of contribution to the environment. I think it's heading in that direction. And hopefully products that can't keep up will die out.
I think this is very insightful. We have one last question before we close this webinar. It is, what's a tip that you would give someone to stay vegan for a sustained period of time? And how would you deal with cravings if they were to pop up? Cravings in the sense of non-vegan items.
I think the world is increasingly getting to a point where all your cravings are easily met by vegan options, right? So I've had some of the best vegan ice cream. I've had amazing vegan pizzas, burgers. I've had vegan beef patties. I've had vegan chicken nuggets. Not all of them are accessible in India, but there are really cool startups. I think one of them is Good Dot. Shout out to Good Dot. They're doing amazing work with making plant-based meat more accessible. And there are startups like Goodmylk that's working on making plant-based dairy delicious and accessible. So you may not get a at this point in India, at least, you may not get something that is 100% the same as dairy, but also it doesn't have to be. I think people just fundamentally want good tasting products, and there are a variety of ways where you can accomplish that. Uh, how do you stay vegan? I think just really look at why you're vegan in the first place. You're not vegan because almond milk tastes good. You're vegan because animals are hurt. Almond milk is eventually going to taste better over time, and there's going to be new plant-based dairy alternatives. But unless you remain vegan, the animal cruelty part is not going away. So think about the larger picture. Think about who we share our planet with. We don't own the planet. We live it for a short period of time. And it is our responsibility to live as lightly as we can and tread as gently as possible before we exit. So take a time to take a moment to consider everybody around us, and that would, I think, be the easiest way you can stay vegan. And as for cravings, startups like Goodmylk are solid in that. And before you know it, really, a lot has changed in the last 3 years. And in the next 2 years, I think there's going to be an explosion of some amazing alternatives. I can't wait. I'm really excited for India. Imagine 1.3 billion people having access to amazing, affordable plant-based food. I think that really gets me going. So it's a matter of time, and we're going to get there. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much for answering all the questions. This was really insightful. I will be ending the webinar now, unless you have something that you want to end with.
So I just wanted to, thank everybody for the questions. They were great. They really made me think. And of course, thanks to Disha for this session.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.